My mirror reflection is dead but left me a message. Blog post number 1. My reflection is dead. Dear reader, I have seen death. No, that isn't clickbait. For once, I am at a loss for words. This morning I woke up, nothing funny there, and I don't like to start my post with it, but it's the only normal thing that happened, and I went into the bathroom to get ready for the day. I was twiddling with the end of my hair, still contained in a sleep braid to keep my curls within reason. Check out previous posts for hair care advice. I already had toothpaste on the toothbrush and lifted it up to my mouth when I noticed I had no reflection. At first, I thought it might be some sort of prank. Last month that was all the rage, and I know I pranked quite a few people myself. I have no idea how someone would get a reflection not to reflect. If you do, maybe shoot me a DM. Anyhow, back on point, I'm feeling a bit scattered by all this. Everything else in the mirror was reflecting correctly. Even the toothbrush showed up as I lifted it up. Thinking something might be wrong with the mirror, I picked up my hand mirror and focused it on my face. Nothing. No matter how I twisted or turned the angle I stood in, I couldn't catch my reflection at all. I always like to see myself in the morning, pretty certain that's normal, but somehow not being able to view my reflection made it truly desperate that I get a glimpse. I'm sure you remember from my post last month that I had those full-length mirrors installed in the living room so I could focus on my dancing form better. This morning, I decided to skip the toothbrushing, and I hurried out to give my dancer's mirrors another use, giving me peace of mind. I was hoping to see my reflection there. Maybe I should have hoped more carefully, because while I saw my reflection, it wasn't exactly soothing. What I actually saw was my reflection lying dead on the floor. Not proud of it, but I kind of froze at that point, just staring. Did this mean that I was dead? Maybe I was a ghost and just didn't know it yet, wandering around my house. But without a physical body, I couldn't reflect. And the me lying on the floor was obviously dead. Pasty pale skin, limbs stiff, eyes glazed and mouth white. Seeing myself dead was a very surreal sort of thing and not a heartening experience. But I felt real and alive. Just to assure myself, I pressed a finger to my neck and there was a pulse. My mouth tasted sort of bitter and swampy. You know, like I'd skipped brushing my teeth that morning. I pinched my arm and the bite of my nails hurt. There aren't a lot of facts about ghosts to check against, but I didn't think I fit the bill. Let me know if you have any pertinent facts. My first reaction was to run out of the house, but something about my dead reflection called to me. In the reflection, I was wearing my pajamas and my hair was still in my sleep braid. Pretty much exactly as I looked physically in real life, except, my reflection was holding this scrap of paper with neat black writing on it. Her dead fingers were clamped tightly on the paper. I recognized the handwriting as my own and moved closer, trying to get a peek at what Mirror Me had written. No matter how I turned, twisted, or adjusted the light, I couldn't make it out. And I didn't really have time to figure it out. It's a workday after all, though. I'm not sure what the precedent for skipping work after seeing your dead reflection is, but I know my boss wouldn't like it. More on this later. I'm off to work. But I feel like there's something on that paper that I need to discover, something important. Blog post number 2 following the clues. Dear reader. Okay, back for another entry. 2 posts a day won't become my new normal, but just this once it seems justified. My reflection wasn't in any of the mirrors at work or on any reflective surfaces. I thought I could power through and just have a normal day, but that didn't work. I haven't even gotten around to answering all of your comments, sorry about that. It was just too weird seeing myself absent from the windows I walked by and the bathroom mirrors. I haven't been able to focus on anything else. So I bowed out of work, sick. Everyone believed me. I must look a fright. Not like I can tell since I can't see myself. And no, I'm not posting any pictures. I'm a little afraid I won't show up there either, so I'm not looking. Not being able to see myself is just awful, though. Except, that's a lie. I can see myself, but I can only do that in the one reflection in the dancer's mirrors in the living room. I'm glancing over at her now. She's still in her pajamas and sleep braid. And that paper is still clutched in her hand. I admit that by the time I bailed on work and saw all of your curious comments from this morning's post, I was committed to reading what that paper said. But no matter what I tried, I couldn't make it out. I even attempted to bring in a magnifying glass, but that reflected in the mirror and blocked the paper entirely. That attempt failed, and without some sort of aid, the angle was just too bad and the words too distant. Luck was on my side, was it? I mean, if luck was really on my side, none of this would be happening, and when I went to get some fresh air, my hair blew up in my face, tickling at my nose and cheeks. I had an idea. Despite what some of the trolls on this page think, I do have those on occasion. The wind was really kicking outside, and if that was true here, maybe it was true for my reflection's reality. After all, everything else from the room I was in was still reflecting properly. Once I was back inside the house, I opened the window and let the wind rustle the paper in my reflection's hand. The first attempt didn't really help. The second attempt knocked the paper loose just a little, freeing one corner of the paper to rustle and wave as the gusts of air hit. After a few tries of opening and closing the window, I got the note into a position that was readable. I had to squint, but I made out the text. I'm almost afraid to record what it said here. I'll sleep on it. Blog post number 3. The message on the paper. Dear reader, stop with the comments, please. Some things are serious. I've already called in sick to work, and honestly, I almost didn't sit down here to write. A lot of you have commented on the note in yesterday's posts. I'm not sure how to feel about what you are saying. I'm a little insulted, honestly. This isn't some goofy prank. I'm attaching a picture. Turns out I do show up on camera. I tried to get my reflection in the shot. You can kind of see her there in the corner, lying on the carpet. See? You can see that, right? Once I took the picture, I threw a blanket over the spot where my reflection was lying. I hoped it would cover her up on her side. She looks more and more dead by the hour. But my attempt with the blanket didn't do much. It appeared underneath her on the reflection. Maybe because on this side she isn't here. I can't manipulate her directly. I lit a candle and said a little prayer, but that felt off. Like, who am I mourning exactly? She's me. I'm here. There really isn't a clear way to proceed at this point. Whatever else is true, people seem interested in the note and I can't stop going over the words, so I decided to share a little more. I need to share something. My head is spinning, and I feel oddly alone. You don't think of your reflections as being a part of you or as being a friend. But I think she was. I miss her. The note in my reflection's hand said, I apologize for the shock. The end of your plane of existence is near, but you can save yourself by traversing to my side of the reflection. I thought long and hard about how to save you, and I could find no perfect option. As we can't coexist in the same place at the same time, I killed myself for you to have a chance to live. I'm also giving you instructions on how to trespass between planes through the mirror when the time arrives. You will know when the moment has come. Wish you a long and happy life. Love you. That's it. Or that isn't it. There is quite a bit more. But I'm not sharing anything beyond that. She did leave instructions, but I feel weird sharing them. Somehow, I know that they were only meant for me to see. Giving you access is a trespass that feels unforgivable. However, I do feel I owe my readers something. The instructions are strange and very specific. Not the sort of instructions I ever would have deemed necessary to cross planes. I know that I couldn't have made them up. This is the second day of no reflections, and I admit it's affecting my head. I can't really tell anyone but you, since I'd probably just be bundled off into a straitjacket. I'm trying to laugh it off and hoping that tomorrow when I wake up, everything will be back to normal. Maybe I'll be able to forget about all of this like a bad dream. But nothing feels right. My own dead face stares back at me. Blog post number 4. Don't you feel it? Dear reader, I realize it has been days and I haven't written, but well, this blog seems kind of pointless. And I have been reading your, often nasty, comments. No, this is still not a joke, and no, I have not lost my mind. I have never been more certain of anything. I wish there was a way I could make you see how serious this is. It is a shock that all of you can't feel the dark aura wafting over the world. The air feels different. Everything is different. The end is upon us. I feel it in the air, moving on the wind, in the hollow sound of people's voices. No one else seems to notice. They just go on with their lives, completely oblivious to the ominous shadows that are slowly but surely embracing the world. Certainly, your comments don't reflect any sort of awareness. Reflect. How odd to use that word so casually. Before now, I never pondered reflections much at all, but now, I think often of what a reflection is and what it would mean to live in a world of reflected objects. Is the light different there? Is there sound? Smell? If I'm going to live there, I suppose I'll find out, but it is worrisome not knowing. What happens in the reflection's plane of existence when the reflection isn't in use? Do they act on their own or just wait for us? If I'm a reflection, but I no longer exist in this plane of existence, what does that mean? Finding out is both exciting and terrifying. This is similar to what I always imagined a bride felt like on her wedding day. I'll never get married now, will I? Maybe that happens where I'm going too. Don't know, but these nerves are spot on to what I imagined, which makes me think something good is waiting for me. A new life is going to start. I must leave this plane of existence. I've gone over my reflection's instructions for gaining access to an alternate plane again and again. I know the way, and I'm prepared to follow each step. I really don't know why I haven't already. Even typing this feels hollow and empty. I guess I just want to wish my friends and family good luck. I want to see if any of you out there reading this have the same experience. Maybe I can hope to meet some of you on the other side. I really don't know what will happen to those left behind. To those who can't feel the doom in the air. I'm afraid to go alone. That's the truth. Yet the body in the mirror is rotting now. Little mold patches mar my face. I feel I owe it to my reflection to help her somehow, but I'm afraid. What is on that side? Doom is all that remains here, but what awaits me there? There is something about the unknown that is terrifying, that humanity has hidden from for its entire existence. We like to understand, but sometimes understanding is not in the cards. Sometimes, we need to have faith. Blog post number 5 piece. Dear reader, all doubt has fled. I am on the only path possible for me to take. Even reading your comments now leaves me with a slow, sad feeling, as if even in the impersonal medium of the internet I can feel the clouds swooping in and drowning out the edges of this plane of existence. You mean nothing. Or you mean everything, but that version of everything is fading. This will be my last blog post. I apologize, but your comments will go unread. This is the last time I will sit at this computer and reach across the electronic void. A new home will welcome me soon. I am certain that peace, serenity, and beauty await me. I hope you also find peace in whatever is coming. Farewell, and may we meet again on the other side. You have reached your destination. Adam hated people, but his job required him to be sociable. Needless to say, work took a lot out of him. He didn't think it was too much to ask that when he got home he could just sit on the couch, watch television, and not be bothered for a few hours. His wife, Nancy, didn't feel the same way and would badger him with questions. Why aren't you talking? Are you mad at me? And so on. Adam loved her with all his heart, but there were times that he wanted to shout at her. After a brutally long and slow day, Adam arrived home to see Nancy tending the small garden she had cultivated. Putting the truck in the park, he jumped out and started to make his way inside. "Come over here," Nancy called out, choosing to use her forearm to wipe the sweat from her brow since her garden gloves were covered in dirt. Adam recognized the tone and already didn't like where this was going, but he made his way over to her. "What?" "Lila is coming over," Nancy said. Lila was his younger sister. Her husband committed suicide in the first few weeks of quarantine and she never fully recovered from that. She tried to distract herself from the pain, but isolation and the internet led to her believing lots of conspiracy theories that Adam and Nancy could barely tolerate. "Great," he said with a nod. "Did she say anything?" "She was excited about something. Couldn't wait to show us," Nancy answered. Lila had always been mercurial and full of energy, so Adam knew that whatever made her excited could be anything from telepathic crystals, gun control, herbicide, or literally anything else. Every time he tried to prepare himself for his sister's current passion, and every time he wasn't prepared enough. "What is she excited about this time?" Adam asked. "I don't know," Nancy answered, returning to her garden. After taking his shower and changing out of his work clothes, Adam went to the fridge to grab himself a beer. The moment he sat down on the couch to watch some highlights on ESPN, he heard a car door close. Outside, Nancy squealed in delight and hustled over to Lila to give her a hug. It was hard for Lila to make friends, so Adam was happy that his wife and sister were this close. The two spoke outside for a long time before the sound of their voices grew louder as they approached the house. When they came in, Nancy gave Adam a look that begged him to be patient. "Hey, Lila," Adam said, lifting his chin but not getting off the couch. "How are you doing?" "Not too bad," Lila answered. She was clearly very excited about something. "Want to do something fun?" Nancy gave her husband another look. "That depends," Adam answered slowly. "Have you heard of ARG?" Lila asked. Adam swallowed a groan. After the day he had, he wasn't sure if he could handle whatever Lila had cooked up. "No," Adam answered. "It's like a game. It's interactive." Adam nodded. "Okay. So, I've been doing this one for the last week, right? Started on Reddit, then it took me to a website. I looked up the source code and found a secret message. That took me to a website that gave me a 404 message, only it wasn't really a 404 message, it was designed to sort of look like one. On the bottom of that page was another clue, so when I deciphered that Adam didn't understand what she was talking about. He wasn't as tech savvy as his sister and she was talking too fast for him to keep up. He twirled his fingers to get her to hurry up and get to the point. "Skip to the end, Lila." "Okay," Lila said before taking a breath. "So, can I get a ride?" "Why?" Adam asked. "The final clue had me download a program for my phone's GPS." "Look," Lila said, holding out her phone for Adam to see. Adam took the phone and looked. The app that was open didn't have a route highlighting the roads to take. However, on the top of the screen it said to take a left out of his driveway and turn left on Chokecherry Road. "What's this?" Adam asked. "Think of it like a scavenger hunt. I think there is a prize if we follow it to the end," Lila answered. "So where is it?" Adam asked. "I don't know. We have to listen to the voice of the robot lady as it gives us step-by-step directions," Lila answered. "How far away is it?" asked Nancy. Adam nodded. "Yeah, I'm not driving across the country." Lila nodded. "All the clues make me think it's in this state," Lila answered. Seeing her brother and sister-in-law's reaction, she knew this was not something they wanted to hear. "I will pay for gas. All the food too." "I don't," Adam started. "Sure," Nancy said, interrupting Adam, who gave his wife a glare. "It will be fun." "I am not driving all over the state, Nance," Adam said, using the nickname he only used whenever he was irritated. "It'll be dark in 2 hours," Nancy said before looking at Lila. "Once it's dark we turn back though, okay?" "Yes. Yeah, sure. Let's go," Lila exclaimed before giving Nancy a hug. When her back was turned, Adam gave his wife an angry look. If there was anything he hated more than being taken away from his downtime, it was when he was roped into doing something he didn't want to do. When Lila was out of earshot, Nancy turned to Adam and asked for him to just go along with it. She needs something to do. Besides, I've been cooped up here all week, so I need it too. The three of them decided to take Adam's car to follow the step-by-step instructions since it had the best gas mileage. They only stopped once to pick up something to drink. Even though they said that they were only going to drive for 2 hours, it felt a lot longer due to how silent it was in the car, so they could hear the GPS giving them directions. They hadn't seen any cars on the unpaved road the GPS led them on for nearly half an hour. By the time they came across a sign that announced they had arrived in the town of Gray Hill, Adam was about to say something about turning back since it was dark and he was getting the jitters. Before he could say anything though, the GPS spoke again. In half a mile, turn left on, unnamed, road. Unnamed road? Adam asked with a scoff. Really? If the road is unnamed, then we must be close, right? Nancy asked. Right, Lila agreed from the backseat. Her excitement rekindled. Adam groaned. Turn left in 500 feet, the GPS later said. Adam slowed down, and even with all three of them looking, they didn't see any road. Where? Lila asked, but was interrupted by the GPS. Recalibrating. Make a U-turn and take a right on unnamed road. Did you see a road? Nancy asked as she scanned the side of the road that was thick with trees and swamps, but as far as she could tell there was no road. No, Adam answered as he turned around. In 50 feet, take a right on unnamed road, the GPS ordered. There, Nancy said, pointing. It's right there. Adam was impressed his wife was able to see the road that didn't look like it had been used in decades. When he turned onto the road, he immediately felt how badly maintained it was. He was going to complain, but before he could, the GPS spoke up again. Your destination is in 1 mile. Adam breathed a sigh of relief. 1 more mile and this trip was going to be done and they could go home. Destination? Lila exclaimed. We're going to do it. We're going to do it. She shouted as she bounced around in the back seat. No one said anything for a long time. The road grew more and more narrow the further they got, and even though they never went over 10 miles an hour, they could still feel the car bottom out. Each time this happened, Adam would curse under his breath. Adam felt Nancy reach over to hold his hand to remind him to calm down. The GPS continued giving periodic updates, but when it said your destination will be in 1/4 of a mile, Adam swore he heard the voice change just a little. As if the robot felt a tickle in its throat. Adam ignored this and chalked it up to being tired and angry. The road brought them to a blind turn, and as soon as it was taken they saw a car parked in the middle of the narrow, shoulderless road. Adam stopped the car and noticed the one in front of them had its driver's door open. Your destination is in 1,000 feet. Lila sighed. We aren't the first ones here. Maybe someone is here to congratulate us? Nancy said, trying to comfort her sister-in-law. Even if that isn't the case, at least we made it, right? As Nancy was talking, Adam saw that there was more than just that one car in front of them. There were at least 3, all parked bumper to bumper. Your destination is in 950 feet. Everyone grew silent at this update and a look was shared between them. Wait, wasn't it 1,000 feet away? Asked Nancy. We didn't move. Let's just walk, Lila suggested, but both Adam and Nancy were quick to say no to that. Your destination is in 900 feet. I don't like this, Nancy complained, feeling fear swell up inside of her. You are a bunch of babies, Lila scoffed. I'm walking. Lila, no, Adam said, but she was already out of the car. Lila started walking to the parked cars but didn't even make it to her brother's front bumper before freezing in place and staring straight ahead. Even in the dark, Adam could tell that all color left her face. Her phone gave another periodic update. Your destination is in 800 feet. When Lila spoke, it was barely a whisper. We need to go. The fear emanating from her spread like wildfire between them. What? Adam asked. Happy that she was the one who suggested it, but I worried about why she would in the first place. Adam turned to look where she was staring at but couldn't see anything while seated. We need to go, Lila said as she took a step backward. her eyes still staring at whatever it was beyond the parked cars. Your destination is in 700 feet. The announcement from her phone made her rush, and before she even shut the door, Adam put the car in reverse and hit the gas. What did you see? Asked a worried Nancy. Just go, Lila cried. We have to go. Your destination is in 600 feet. This time when the GPS spoke, there was no mistake that there was a subtle change in the voice, but there were more pressing matters at hand, and Adam gunned it as much as he dared considering the condition of the road and the fact he was going in reverse. Lila, what is it? Nancy asked, worried. What is out there? Shut up and drive, Lila screamed, her eyes wet from tears. Adam had never seen his sister this scared, and it terrified him, prompting him to quickly turn around when it was safe to do so. He then put the car in drive and hit the gas. Go! Go! Shouted Lila as she looked out the back window. Recalibrating. Make a U-turn. Your destination is in 500 feet. What's back there? Nancy shouted, but Lila could only shout for them to go faster. Lila, Adam shouted. What the hell did you see? Recalibrating. Make a U-turn. Your destination is in 400 feet. Adam was pushing 30 miles an hour on that unnamed road. Every bump sent them in the air, causing them to hit their heads on the ceiling. Buckle up, Adam ordered after taking a peek in the rearview mirror and seeing his sister was completely turned around and on her knees to look behind them. Recalibrating. Make a U-turn. Your destination is in 300 feet. Lila was feverishly slapping the back of her seat, crying and screaming to go faster. Lila, hun. You need to buckle, Nancy started, but as she said this she saw what terrified Lila and her jaw dropped. Recalibrating. Make a U-turn. Your destination is in 200 feet. What? Adam shouted, noticing his wife was shaking. When she didn't answer, Adam shouted. What is it? Go, Nancy said, her eyes wide in terror and her voice was barely audible. Recalibrating. Make a U-turn. Your destination is in 100 feet. Adam pushed the car even faster, causing all their heads to hit the ceiling every time they hit one of the frequent bumps in the road. What's back there? Adam shouted again. Recalibrating. Make a U-turn. Your destination is in 50 feet. What's back there? Adam shouted, looking in the rearview mirror but not seeing anything in the red glow of his tail lights. Recalibrating. You have reached your destination. Other than the screaming and begging to go faster, those were the last words Adam remembered hearing before the car flipped through the air. When Adam woke up the next morning, he was bleeding from the crash and was hanging upside down due to being buckled up. Once he regained his senses, noticed that he was the only one in the car, and remembered what happened the night before, he crawled out of the car to look for his wife and sister around the wreckage. He called out for Nancy and Lila as he searched the area just in case they were ejected from the crash, but he didn't find anything and there was no reply. Once the realization that he was alone burrowed its way into his head, Adam stopped calling. In that silence, the only thing he could hear, other than his own rapid breathing, was the haunting sound of the wind blowing through the trees. My dad thought my brother and I were going to be kidnapped. When my brother and I were still young children, our parents got divorced. I live in the UK and this story took place roughly between 1998 and 2000. Like in most divorce situations, our dad moved out to be closer to where he worked at the time. He moved to South Wales. If memory serves, we were seeing him every other weekend at this point. You know how it is with the passage of time, some things you forget, but others stay with you. Anyway, we were in a town called Brecon. We used to go there with our dog and play a lot of cricket on the fields by the promenade, and this day was no different. It was getting later in the day and I'm pretty sure my brother and I were probably getting hungry. We packed up our stuff and walked back to the car. I think my dad probably needed cigarettes or something. So before we headed home, we popped around the corner to a petrol station. At the time he drove a maroon-colored Rover 200 saloon thingy. My dad parks his car off to the side away from the pumps, but still in front of the windows to the shop so he can see my brother and me. He then gets out of the car and goes into the shop, leaving my brother and I in the car. He'd left his driver's side window open, and not long after my dad left us, a man with long brown hair and a ponytail and no shirt on came up to the car and said something to my brother and me. Though I don't remember exactly what he said. It was probably "Where's your mom and dad" or something of that nature. To our horror, the man opens the door, gets into the car with us, and begins to start the engine, slaps the car in reverse, and begins moving slowly backward. I remember that prickly feeling of fear all over my body. My brother and I just look at each other like, fuck, what do we do? I tell him to get out and we need to find dad. We grab for the handles of our doors to get out, and as I open my door I hear, "What the fuck do you think you're doing, mate?" The driver's door flies open and my dad just yanks this dude out of the car. I hear the dude kind of stutter out, "You were parked over my drive. I was just moving your car out of my way because I didn't know when you were coming back." I don't remember what my dad said to him afterwards, but he got in the car and made sure we were both okay. Looking back as an adult, I don't know why my dad left his car unlocked with his keys in the ignition and his 2 young children in the back. It was a different time, as they say. My criticism of my dad aside, I still to this day do not know why that man saw a car over his driveway and then saw 2 small children in the back of it. He didn't then just go into the petrol station shop and find out who owned the car. Frickin' insane, man. The night shift. Halfway through her night shift at George Taffel's funeral home, Anne Loudrain almost fainted when the dead man let out a sigh which was barely audible yet still distinguishable from anything else. She had just finished washing the body of old Mr. James Tripplehorn and was staring at his wrinkled face. It was so white it looked as if it were caked in some kind of white powder. The eyelids were partially open, revealing the foggy blue eyes behind them. Between the monotonous buzzing of the neon lamp overhead and her own ragged breathing, the subtle and plaintive sigh had announced itself. She backed up immediately as her whole body started to shake from fear, realizing at the same time how unusually quiet it was in the funeral home. Against her will, her eyes reluctantly cast to the dead man's face again, which was contorted into a permanent look of deep agony as rigor mortis had set in hours ago. Earlier that afternoon, she had overheard Mr. Crow tell Mrs. Taffel that Mr. Tripplehorn died from acute benzodiazepine intoxication. It was a suicide. The man had been neck-deep in debt and lived alone in his cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town when he decided to end his own miserable and lonely existence. She tried to ease her rapid breathing as she rubbed her eyes with the back of her arm, wondering if she had only imagined it. Working the night shift had probably taken a toll on her mental health. And yet the horrid sound had deposited itself into her brain. She opened her mouth, ready to challenge the onslaught of what was coming next. But her voice got choked up in her throat. She waited. But nothing else happened. Mr. Tripplehorn was dead. He had been dead for more than 15 hours now. So what was it that she had heard? As if answering her confusion, a faint and low hiss suddenly broke the silence and filled the whole room. There was no doubt in her that it was coming out of the dead man's sewn-shut mouth as if he were gritting his teeth in agony. To say it was unsettling was an understatement. Her blood ran cold and she decided to make a run for it. She crossed to the door quickly, pulled it open, and sprinted down the dark and long corridor, feeling as if her knees were about to give out soon. Maya Taffel barely looked up from the old gossip magazine she was reading when her door swung open loudly, a cigarette pinched between her 2 small fingers. Anne threw herself in without a second thought, her face as white as a sheet. Mrs. Taffel threw her a quick glance of disapproval, her huge and heavy-looking diamond hoop earrings glistening in the spill of her desk lamplight. "Yes?" Mrs. Taffel grunted as she gave Anne a perfunctory, half-angry nod. There's something terribly wrong with Mr. Triplehorn's body," Anne croaked, clutching her hand tight, still half crying. "What do you mean wrong?" asked Mrs. Taffel, still not looking up from her magazine. It was making these weird noises, Anne." "What weird noises?" Mrs. Taffel blurted out as she put her magazine down and stared at Anne, frowning. It groaned. And it hissed at me." The words were no sooner out of her mouth before she realized how utterly dumb they sounded even to herself. Mrs. Taffel didn't say a word at first. She rolled her eyes and hissed around the cigarette filter clamped between her tiny teeth. The tired and slightly annoyed look on her round plump face was a silent condemnation of what might have been the silliest story she had just ever heard in her entire life. "You know, Anne, was it?" she said softly, a flat smile plastered on her face. "I've been doing this job for almost 15 years now. When my husband passed away, I inherited this place." She offered Anne a cigarette, which the latter refused with a headshake and weak smile. Mrs. Taffel shrugged. "Did I want it? No. Did I like it? No. But it was neither a matter of what I wanted nor what I liked. It's what this little sleepy town needed. And I gave them just that." Mrs. Taffel took a final long pull on her cigar and flicked the butt under the table casually. "My late husband was a decent and kind human. A beautiful soul that could embarrass a saint. It's almost impossible to try to live up to that, you know, a huge responsibility and reputation to hold up, made exceptionally difficult because the people of this town were so judgmental. One false move, and the theatrics out of these people, my God. You would think you were living in the time of Jesus." She shook her head and let out a brief mirthless laugh. "I could have had this whole place torn down and started my own business. I'd always wanted to have a boutique or a beauty salon, away from the grim and lingering stench of death. But I didn't. If that's not an act of selflessness and kindness, then I don't know what is." She took a sip of her cold coffee as an awkward silence permeated the whole room. "I'm the type of person who straightens out the wrinkles in other people's personalities. I push them to be the best version of themselves, as I did to myself years ago. And now, kid, I'm gonna push you," she explained, a note of impatience in her high-pitched childlike voice. "We're a team here. And I need you to hold your end of the weight and do your job well." Anne's terrified expression melted into a subtle look of confusion. It wasn't so much Mrs. Taffel's convoluted story, which amounted to little more than a weak excuse for her arrogance, as her complete refusal to address the situation that made Anne look at her in disbelief. Anne herself would fess up, albeit reluctantly, that she settled for this job. She had had no prior experience dealing with dead bodies when she decided to apply and thought she would just wing it and be okay. She didn't hate it. It was just not what she was looking for. Glenmore was a small town where an overwhelming preponderance of young men and women had no choice but to work at old farms of which their own parents were the owners. "I make no concession to working with anybody. It's my business and I run it how I like it." She shrugged as she lit another cigarette. "Now go back to what you were supposed to be doing." "I'm busy," she said, waving one hand dismissively and going back to flicking through her gossip magazine with the other. Anne stalked out of the room silently, defeated. It wasn't the first time that prickly woman had blown her off unceremoniously like that. She glanced down at her watch. A few hours left and she'd call it a night and be done for the night. Maybe she'd whip together a simple chicken soup before bedtime. She hoped someone would be available to fill in for her because she didn't feel like going to work tomorrow. The long narrow corridor looked dark and deserted as she made her way back to the embalming room, her footsteps echoing off the dull green walls. "I must have imagined it," she thought to herself. "There's no such thing as." She pushed the door open and it creaked and groaned loudly. The naked pale body was still there, slathered in a strange bluish light emanating from the lamp above it, supine on the porcelain table where she had left it. Very dead, obviously. What had she expected? That it had somehow changed positions or disappeared? Probably off taking a long stroll somewhere? She almost laughed to herself but held it in. Her stomach knotted up again as she approached the corpse cautiously, unkeen to receive any more surprises for the night. She was aware of how ludicrous she must have looked tonight. Mrs. Taffel was not one to cross. Not when she had got off on the wrong foot with the sharp-tongued woman by arriving late to her first night of working at the old funeral home. If there's one thing Mrs. Taffel hated the most in this world, it was sass and or tardiness. Anne was lucky Mrs. Taffel hadn't snapped at her or given her an earful about taking one's job seriously, because the fierce-looking woman had looked as if she was ready to swallow Anne whole. Anne glanced expectantly over her shoulder at the rectangle door behind her, suddenly feeling utterly alone again. The dank and grim atmosphere of the embalming room added a sense of desolation. But she had a job to do. It didn't matter whether she liked it or not. The initial excitement of being free and making a fresh start had dwindled. Caleb, her boyfriend of 3 years, had dumped her and kicked her out. She had nowhere to go. She was well aware that she should have been kinder to herself and not ignored all the red flags and mixed in with charm and seeming affection. Now she kept telling herself that she needed this job. She reluctantly grabbed a piece of clean and neatly folded cloth, crumpled it up, then started dabbing it carefully on the dead man's pale chest. He was so skinny she could feel his ribs sticking out. As her fear began to unravel slowly, she found herself humming a familiar tune from her childhood which her mother used to sing to her whenever she felt sad or scared. She yawned, shook her head to fight off sleepiness, and went on singing under her breath. It was all she could do to stay focused, for another sound was heard as soon as she went silent. At first, she thought it was only her own voice bouncing off the walls. She cocked her ears and the deep guttural growl resumed more clearly, followed by a long faint wail that made every hair on her body stand on end. Her heart leapt and she dropped the cloth where it landed on the old man's chest. This time Anne was convinced she wasn't only imagining it. She backed away quickly right when the door behind her swung open with a loud metallic screech. She let out a high-pitched yelp instantly and turned around to find Mrs. Taffel frowning at her. "What now?" the fierce-looking woman snapped at Anne. Without waiting for an answer, Mrs. Taffel sauntered into the room and approached the corpse matter-of-factly. Pale-faced, teary-eyed, and still trembling with fear, Anne struggled to speak. But Mrs. Taffel's stone-cold expression told her that it didn't look like the woman was waiting for her to answer. So Anne didn't bother, and instead, she watched as Mrs. Taffel put on her gloves, grabbed the crumpled cloth, tossed it aside, and pressed the corpse's chest with 2 fingers repeatedly. A sloshing sound escaped its grayish mouth, followed by what could only be described as a guttural groan, which made Anne take another step away immediately. "He's already decomposing fast," said Mrs. Taffel indifferently, as if this gruesome observation was merely evidence of something she had already expected. "He had been dead for more than 7 hours when they found him anyway." Anne decided to clear her throat. "But what about that weird noise coming out of his mouth just now?" she asked, squinting through her tears. "What about it?" "How?" Anne stammered, almost hysterically. "How's that even possible?" He's already dead," Mrs. Taffel tsked as she shook her head incredulously. "When somebody dies, they may still have air trapped in their lungs or stomach. As bacteria consume their insides, gas and waste are released, which causes the body to bloat." Anne didn't say a word. Her face felt cold and her lips thin to nothing, and tears were rolling down her cheeks. "If you move it, the built-up gas may become dislodged unexpectedly, and even make the body twitch." Anne stared at Mrs. Taffel, expecting a final summation that would shed some light on this disconcerting and gruesome phenomenon she had never been made aware of. She had to take a moment and swallow hard several times. If she had found it almost difficult to speak before, now feeling ashamed and utterly stupid, she felt a lump close her throat down. It would be impossible to speak for a while. As it flows past the vocal cord, Mrs. Taffel went on, "It can cause the grunting, moaning, or hissing sound you just heard. Anna continued watching silently as Mrs. Taffel proceeded to place a white linen sheet over the corpse. "Put him back in the freezer now," Mrs. Taffel demanded dismissively. "I'll go find Patrick and tell him to bring in the stretcher." She walked out without even turning to look at Anne, who nodded immediately and tried to regain her composure. A few minutes later Anne found herself pushing the corpse-laden stretcher alone through the empty, long, and narrow corridor. Between the irritating sound of the wheels of the stretcher squeaking loudly and her own footsteps ricocheting off the walls, she could vaguely hear the muffled sound of wind and rain lashing unmercifully at the windows. It occurred to her that she had forgotten her raincoat at her cousin's place. As she pressed on through the empty corridor, listening to the distant rumble of thunder outside, she realized that the temperature had dropped significantly below the level to which her body had already grown accustomed. Something just felt different tonight. She felt it. It wasn't so much the extra cold the storm had brought in as the feeling of being alone and trapped in a place that reeked of death. That suddenly prompted Anne to shudder and grit her teeth. When she reached the end of the corridor, she pressed the elevator button quickly. Lightning flashed with sudden bursts of light seeping in through the sides and from the top of the closed blinds, momentarily illuminating the whole corridor. She peeked through one of the blinds to catch a glimpse of the storm, but it was too dark outside. Still, she could not wait to get home and shrink into her own peaceful thoughts in the shower with the hot water running before bed. The elevator doors parted with a metallic clunk in front of her and she proceeded to push the stretcher inside very carefully, making sure to position it off-center to give some room for herself in the long narrow car. She hobbled inside and pressed herself against the wall, keeping her distance from the dead man. The doors closed automatically as she pressed a button and with a weak jolt, the car started its slow descent. It wasn't her first time being cramped inside the elevator with a dead body, and definitely wouldn't be her last, or so she had thought. But as she tried to get her mind off this intrusive and rather morbid idea, the light above her head started to flicker rapidly. Before she realized what was going on, it suddenly went out and she was plunged into darkness. She let out a yelp of surprise instantly, but then the whole elevator jerked and screeched to a halt with no warning. "This can't be happening," she thought to herself as terror began to seep into her every pore. Her worst nightmare since she started working at the funeral home had finally come true. The horror of it filled her every sense. "Hello?" she shouted at the top of her lungs as her whole body shook hard, fighting the urge to fidget. "Maya? Can anybody hear me? Hello?" Then came the horrifying realization that she was stuck in between floors and nobody could hear her. Tears welling up in her eyes, she shook her head to stop the thought from blossoming into something far worse than she could endure. "Maya? Help! Anybody?" She started banging frantically and blindly on the elevator doors as hard as she could, her chest heaving rapidly with fear. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, then rubbed her face. A dreadful silence filled up the elevator, merging with the darkness, closing in on her from every direction, and what little hope left in her started to fizzle out. She fell on her knees slowly and her whole body shook. Then she started sobbing silently with her hands splayed against the cold floor. She had a hard time controlling her breathing as she closed her eyes, hoping that when she opened them again, the darkness would cease. Maybe the power outage would be over soon. Maybe somebody would realize that she was missing. She opened her eyes expectantly. Nothing. Still, the same dark, sightless cold she found herself in. Slowly her fear turned into anger. Why hasn't that fat old bitch come to get me? She pushed herself up, staggering to her feet woozily. She started kicking and banging on the elevator doors again, harder and more violently. "Hello? Can't anybody fucking hear me?" she snapped. She had never felt this angry in her life before. Not when that good-for-nothing loser of a man Caleb dumped her. Not when her own mother slapped her hard across the face when she refused to give the old bat some money to buy some cigarettes. Not when Maya belittled and mistreated her over and over again. To say that she was angry was an understatement. No. It was something far stronger than that. Her face was burning from exhaustion and fury. She had had enough of people treating her like she was a doormat. Not again. As soon as she got out, she would slap the hell out of that stupid bitch and quit. She deserved better. She would leave this damn town as soon as she could and never look back. The urge had been nagging at her for the past few years. It came in fits and spurts, laced with a sense of freedom and the determination to make her life better. Hello? Maya? Can anybody hear me? Still nothing. She took a deep breath and opened her mouth wide, charging up to scream at the top of her lungs. But the next series of noises she heard stopped her immediately. At first, she thought they were coming from the elevator. Maybe the power had returned. She cocked her ears and realized they were not caused by the power resuming, nor could they be passed off as being similar to the mechanical clanking and groaning of the car moving up and down. The noises went on, a low crackling hiss permeating the darkness, vibrating through the cold air, followed by what could only be described as rattling breathing. A subtle outburst of something that violated the fundamental principles of science. For a moment, Anne just stood there, unthinking, paralyzed with fear. Then she thought of what Maya had told her earlier, and it gave her, no matter how weak, a sense of reassurance. The dead can't hurt you. They're dead. She took in a lungful of air and clenched her fist to try to regain her composure, then resumed her plea for help, more calmly this time. Maya? Hello? Can anybody hear me? A guttural wail rose in the dark behind her, as if answering her. She smacked her lips impatiently, trying her best to ignore it. It's the built-up gas, she said to herself. Maya? Hello? I'm stuck here. She pressed her hands hard against the elevator doors, and then with all her might she tried to pry them open. But nothing happened. The doors wouldn't budge. She kicked the cold hard metal surface in frustration. Another wail reverberated through the walls around her. But it sounded different this time. There was a tone of urgency in it. She had tried to reason out how it could have possibly happened when she first heard it. But even after what Maya told her, there was still a sense of disbelief lingering in her as to what might be behind this unnatural occurrence. Built-up gas seemed to fall short of a satisfying explanation to account for it. Hello? Can anybody hear me? She shouted out loud. A grumble rose loudly in the darkness, as if mocking her, and then stopped abruptly. She held her breath and strained her ears as complete silence overtook the darkness. She found this abrupt cessation of auditory stimuli far worse than anything else. A feeling of unease settled in her stomach. Every hair on her body stood on end. Her head and heart were pounding in unison. So many questions were swirling around in her head. It's the built-up gas, said a faint voice in her head. Get a grip on yourself and stop being an idiot. He's dead. Fucking dead. He can't possibly who. And then the long guttural wail resumed. Louder this time. Oh, shut up. She snapped and clucked her tongue in irritation. I didn't want to be stuck in here with you either. Then she felt a cold draft coming from behind her. Another sound was heard and her blood froze instantly as her fear amplified. This time she was convinced that no built-up gas could possibly be responsible for it. Please! She screamed in terror. Somebody help! Get me out of here! Help! Help me! The eerie sound went on as she kicked and banged hard on the elevator doors like a maniac. Not a growl. Not a hiss. Not a wail. It was a faint chortle that rose slowly to a deep and guttural laugh. Something stirred in the dark and then the whole elevator shuddered when a pair of feet landed heavily on the floor behind her. Anne screamed and screamed until she couldn't anymore. Predatory bear encounter, being hunted. The following events took place in June 2022. My passion is in wild foods. I'm no stranger to working out in the bush for a living. Prior to this I was building mountain bike trails for my friend's company he owned and was a tree planter. I realized mountain biking, while fun, is not something I can use to get ahead in the world. Tree planting, while lucrative, is probably the most miserable I have ever been in the workforce. Good parties though. It's basically sacrificing all comfort and volunteering yourself for hardship and misery so you can earn a bunch of money quickly and have a rave in the woods every 3 days. I always picked mushrooms and foraged for fun, but once I found out I could monetize my passion, that it's in fact a pretty big industry and can be just as lucrative if not more so than planting, I was head over heels. Granted, you need to know what you are doing, what to look for, and where, but you can make a killing if you do. Morels are a very lucrative and sought-after wild mushroom that rely almost entirely on wildfires to produce fruiting bodies. The carbon from a wildfire spikes the pH of the soil in such a way that it is the ample substrate to produce, and the connection between the mycelium and their relationship with the tree roots they depend on becomes disrupted. So they desperately flourish, producing as many more mushrooms as possible, to spread as many spores as possible to re-establish these connections. In turn, they also cleanse the soil and allow the forest to regenerate. Sometimes I find a patch so juicy my jaw just drops and I cannot even believe what I have stumbled across. That being said, it's a dangerous industry. Every picker I have met has some sort of harrowing tale of survival. Each year pickers go missing, either to be found as a corpse or never seen again. Being that far out in the wilderness is inherently dangerous. One time I slipped and almost impaled my chest on my knife. I'd have been so screwed. Even just rolling an ankle that far from a road or a hospital carries its own risks. I have almost died alone in the woods more times than I'd like to admit, and this tale is just one of those times. It was a beautiful bluebird day to be out picking. I was deep in the woods off a logging road inside the Okanagan Indian Band. I must have hiked close to 2 kilometers up the mountain across a cut block and far into the woods. I kept finding clusters, nothing too special. I had come across one hillside that was very steep but was loaded with some big honkers. The top of the ridgeline had various clusters all over it. I had about 25 pounds stuffed into buckets which I had propped up next to a decaying log so they wouldn't tip over. I was taking a break while also scouting the area to see if any more were around. I had pretty much depleted the area on top of the ridgeline and beyond that was too dry for anything to grow. I was scanning around hoping I could find one more cluster. Generally, mushrooms will cluster near a patch. I knew it was around in the general vicinity. My eyes turned back to the direction I came from. There was a really steep hill that plateaued out into another ridgeline, but just below this hill, the ground was littered with burnt pine cones. Then it dawned on me. I'm picking in cedar and birch, there are no pine cones to be had up in here. Holy crap! Those aren't pine cones, I exclaimed to myself in astonishing wonder. I panicked with excitement. Normally I'd have dropped a waypoint to my buckets on my GPS, but if my eyes didn't deceive me, I somehow walked right past the biggest patch of morels I'd ever seen in my life. I scrambled down that steep ass hill as fast as I could, and sure enough, blending into the black soil and singed cedar leaves was an overwhelming surplus of morels. Most of these were young baby mushrooms. If I had my wits about me, I'd have marked this entire area on my GPS also, as that patch would be producing for the next 2 to 3 weeks. Instead, I hungrily and greedily scrambled across the forest floor on my hands and knees, filling my planting bags, my t-shirt, baskets, and everything I could use to store them. There were so many. I was financially struggling and looking so hard that I was ready to cry at the blessing nature had bestowed upon me. I stood up for a second, drenched in sweat. I caught a bad whiff of something in the air. You could liken it to a butthole. Disgusting. I thought to myself. As soon as I get to camp and cash out, I'm heading to town and washing these nasty nose piercings, gonna get some real food, a nice clean shower. I was driven. Shortly after, I thought I heard sticks snapping. I froze. Called out to the wind. Scanned my surroundings. A woodpecker near me started pecking a tree. Damn bird, I said to myself as I resumed working. Little did I know, I was being watched this entire time. I had pretty much filled everything I could carry mushrooms in up to the brim and couldn't pick any more. I resolved to mark this on my GPS, cash out at the nearest fire station, and head back up and pick up until dusk. Suddenly, without warning, I heard a very loud and hollow thud, followed by another. And another. I looked back to the source and it was my mushroom bucket tumbling all the way down the hill, spewing mushrooms in every direction like Sonic the Hedgehog when he loses his rings. A very strong gust of wind came and simultaneously my other bucket followed suit. This was infuriating. I threw a hissy fit and started screaming at my buckets as loud as I could as they tumbled. Screaming expletives, slurs and curse words at the winds, assuming it was a breeze that knocked them over. When I got my composure back, I heard a very loud snap and a loud huff. Right at the top of the ridgeline was a black bear staring me down. I've encountered many a bear with only a few close encounters. The moment I saw this bear, I knew something was off. It was a juvenile, big, yet scrawny. It was bobbing its head up and down and huffing, its fur was standing on end and it was staring right at me. It looked agitated. It took a few steps toward me and I froze up. I knew I had to stay calm, no point in running from a bear. Side note, as I was leaving my car that morning and looking for my bear spray, it was nowhere to be found. I could see it clearly in my mind's eye right next to my bed in my tent. Fuck it, it's not like I'm gonna need it, I said to myself. I also had an X-Acto knife and a buck knife, both of which were black colored and got lost as soon as I set them down in the woods. They blended in seamlessly into the black ground. I was a vulnerable, sitting duck with only my limbs to defend myself. Shit was the only thing that went through my mind at first. It started slowly coming towards me, our eyes were locked together. I started to realize the severity of the situation. I reached for my spray and it wasn't there. I remembered that if a black bear attacks you, you must fight back. Unlike grizzlies, black bears will eat you alive if they attack you. Bears do not kill their prey, they just eat it. Grizzlies will attack if they see you as a threat, and playing dead does in fact work for them. Not black bears. Though rare, black bear attacks on average are more fatal than grizzly attacks. Fun fact. All of these thoughts came rushing through my head so fast I could barely process them. I was still frozen as this bear slowly crept down the long hill toward me, grumbling and growling. To say I felt vulnerable and helpless is an understatement. I realized I was looking this bear directly in the eyes, and even though it was far away, is not something you should ever do. I remember my crew boss in tree planting describing black bears as big raccoons that are easily startled to make lots of noise, get big and try to scare it off. I unclipped the planting bags I was using to store mushrooms on my hips, lifted them over my head to augment my size, and gave a long shout as loud as I could. The bear froze and growled, completely unfazed by this. I stomped the ground and gave a couple of short shouts like a dog would bark. Hey! 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 As soon as I screamed this at the top of my lungs, it erupted into a full-blown charge straight at me. Supposedly the top speed of a bear is 50 to 60 kilometers per hour. It's astounding how explosively fast they reach that top speed. I didn't even have time to flinch before it had cleared all that ground and was upon me. I kept my size augmented with my planting bags and was screaming bloody murder, literally screaming so loud I tasted blood, standing my ground just full-blown panic screaming. This big bastard was stopped 10 feet away from me, snarling, drooling, snapping its jaws, and swiping at me. The bear stopped and I backed up maybe 6 feet before it lunged at me again. I stayed put, screaming at it. This bear got up on its hind legs, staring down at me, and let off a roar. As it came back down on its fours, it snapped its teeth once more and took a swipe at me with its claws. It looked like it was gonna pounce and eat me the next move it made. Without even thinking of it, I took a gamble. I leered at it screaming and kicked a pile of dirt and ash directly into its face and open mouth. This, in hindsight, was very foolish. 9/10 times I would have just pissed it off. But it worked. The bear coughed and huffed, looked at me, and growled before running back up the ridgeline. It spun around and looked like it was gonna charge again, but I raised my bags higher above my head and let out the most desperate cries imaginable. Screaming bloody murder. The bear finally got on top of the ridgeline and I started backing out away from it in the direction I came from initially. It was now following me with eyes on me. The only thing separating us was the long steep hill between ridgelines that was getting longer the further I went. This bear was stalking me as I literally sidestepped in a crab walk, screaming as loud as I could at it. Screaming every curse word in the book until my throat was completely raw. I realized I was still locked in direct eye contact with it and instantly felt like an idiot. I jumped up and down screaming as loud as I could. It huffed and went out of sight. As this bear disappeared behind the ridgeline, I noticed I didn't even have time to realize how scared I actually was. I felt dizzy, my heart was beating out of its chest and sweat was literally pouring off my body. Is it gone? I thought to myself. It was not. It disappeared out of sight and got behind me in the direction I was moving in. I heard brush snapping as it reappeared on top of the ridgeline further down, waiting for me to get closer. Piss off! I shouted, augmenting my size again, making all the ruckus I could. It charged again down the hill at me. Good thing I went poo in the woods before this happened, otherwise I'd have filled my trousers and seasoned myself. This time it charged slightly off to the side of me and blew right past me. Down the hill and out of sight again. I took this opportunity to run in the direction I came in. This was stupid, the sound of my fleeing must have brought it back, because the next thing you know I was staring down at it from the ridgeline I was at. Again I augmented my size and slowly started backing away. This thing ran up onto the ridgeline I was at, paused, then scrambled back up the hill and resumed stalking me from on top of the upper ridgeline again. It ran farther down and waited. I was certain I was gonna die that day. I knew for a fact that I was being hunted. This bear was stalking me and closing a circle around me so it could pounce when it knew I wasn't looking at it. I'm not a religious man, but found myself begging God to save me and begging for forgiveness. It all felt hopeless and in vain. I proceeded along with my exit strategy as this thing went out of sight again. Cautiously I started walking faster until I came around the bend and this bear was right in my path, staring me down and slowly approaching me, snarling and huffing. I knew I was helpless, and so did this bear. I screamed at it, cursing, and started walking carefully up the hill it descended down on me from prior. It approached again and I kicked more dirt at it from a distance that would never reach it. This bear was hesitant. I don't think it really knew what to do, as it has probably never encountered a human, and I was tall with the upper ground now. I slipped walking backward up this steep hill and its interest definitely peaked again. The bear resumed its approach. I had like 25 to 30 pounds of mushrooms in these planting bags I had over my head, and I could barely hold my arms up anymore, so I chucked them downhill at this thing. The bear scrambled towards this scattered mess of mushrooms, sniffed them, bit one, spat it out, and looked at me again. I continued with my exit strategy as it scrambled up the hill so it was level with me. It let out a strange noise as I was shouting once again for it to screw off. It continued approaching, I stopped, and then the bear stopped. This happened frequently, and each time the bear stopped I would resume, and shortly after it would continue stalking me. It appeared to lose interest in me and again ran out of sight. I stood there petrified for a bit until it seemed like it left me alone. At this point, I started hiking with haste in the direction I was retreating in, frequently stopping to listen and check my surroundings. Just before I broke out of the woods into the cut block, I caught another nasty whiff of butthole. I knew the bear was around. I could smell it. These creatures roll in carcasses, feces, and muck. Most times you can smell a bear before you see it. I couldn't see anything. That is, until I noticed it goal-posted between two trees right next to me, still checking me out. Oh God, please no. Please. I started screaming, getting big, screaming every expletive in the book until it felt like my voice was breaking. At this point, I had finally made it to the cut block I hiked in from. I continued backing away. The bear continued approaching. It stopped, however. It was just checking me out from the tree line now and not approaching any further. I was now in a wide open exposed spot where I could see my surroundings without any obstructions. The direction I was fleeing revealed the faint neon colors of the tents back at Jane's camp. Meanwhile, back at Jane's camp, an old man named Chuck, bless his soul, was eating a can of beans and smoking a joint and heard me screaming for a while. He reluctantly decided someone had injured themselves in the bush and went to go investigate. I reached the opposite end of the cut block and the bear looked like it was just a distant furball now. As I was getting closer to the camp, I saw Chuck walking up the hill, joint in hand, asking me if everything is alright. I was so rattled that I frantically explained everything I just went through while hyperventilating and broke down crying in front of this man. Calmly he extended his joint to me. "Here man, take some, you really need it right now." A wave of calm washed over me. He offered me water, We walked down the hill to a spring coming out of the mountain and I splashed water on my face. I felt safe, I felt like the situation was over. I got my bearings again and started breaking down. I worked almost 9 hours and lost all of my mushrooms. Bless this man, as his response was, "Oh fuck buddy, you lost all of it? Come on, let's go get them." After a lot of back and forth, he convinced me of things I should have done to avoid that situation altogether and convinced me of strength in numbers. I explained I had no waypoint on my GPS and that it would be a mission. He asked if I could trace my steps and find the area again. "I think so," I replied. "Let's go then, come on before it gets dark." "What about the bear?" "What bear?" I looked back and the bear was gone. He had spray, so we started booting back up the mountain. It was a wild goose chase, but 2.5 hours of hiking later, as we were giving up and the sun was setting, I found them. We hastily packed these mushrooms out of the woods and got back to camp where I cashed out. I thanked Chuck profusely. What a good guy, he didn't even ask for a cut for helping me. Now, I was debating even including this information, but I feel it's somehow important. That year I was in a deep depression where I was strongly considering suicide. This experience was a spiritual one. And the spiritual revelation that came from all of this was, I am going to friggin' Denny's. I almost died a slow, painful, agonizing death in the woods by myself, and my last meal would have been Vector cereal with no milk. I bought 3 steaks and 4 appetizers. I realized if I ever leave this world, I am not leaving willingly. Whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right?